Bill Maher is officially torching the woke left and its hysterical response to COVID. We're going to look at his latest and frankly brilliant critique of COVID hysteria. We're going to see how even his guest Neil deGrasse Tyson was left speechless by Maher's brutal assessment. And make sure to stick with me to the very end of this video, where we're going to see how this whole woke hysteria is literally all falling apart. You're not going to want to miss this.
Now we're getting some information after a while. We have time to find out just how bad the collateral damage has been. Here's just a few cases. The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. See, right away, I got to say, this pisses me off. I see these headlines all the time. The pandemic didn't do that. The way we handled the pandemic did that. The pandemic certainly was a thing. But let's not just say the pandemic, because it was not written in stone that we had to handle it the way we did. ACT scores are the lowest in 30 years. Anxiety and depression way up. The body mass index increase doubled for kids 2 to 19. Drug overdose deaths. Murders way up. Inflation at a 40-year high. Domestic violence increased. Oh, and my favorite, car crashes. They couldn't figure this out. Like way up. And finally, I love this. This is the expert said. You know what it is? People just went mental. They just went nuts. They're like, I'm home. The fucking kids are here all the time. My stupid husband is here all the time. I'm just going to take it out on the highway. And they did.
Now, I think that Bill Maher is absolutely right here in that distinction that he made at the very beginning, right? We'll often see reports entitled, "The Effects of COVID on Society," or, how the pandemic changed our lives. And Bill Maher is absolutely right here. Hold on, gang. Yes, the pandemic was consequential, but when we're talking about the effects on society and how we live out our lives, we're talking more about how we responded to COVID, not so much COVID itself. And that's absolutely key here. For example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's called the Great Barrington Declaration. It was penned by eminent medical experts in the most prestigious universities in both the U.S. and the U.K. It was published in October of 2020, and it argued for a far less extreme, more scientifically orthodox way of dealing with the virus. And its basic gist was to provide maximum protection for at-risk populations, such as the old or those with pre-existing conditions, while at the same time allowing the rest of the population, particularly school-aged children, to live out their lives as normal. Now, it's no coincidence that you may not be familiar with the Barrington proposal. And that's because we now know, based on internal emails that have been made public, available to the public, Anthony Fauci, along with Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, actively sought to silence and shut down the Barrington proposal, to discredit it. So in effect, it was deliberately hidden from you. This is what makes censorship so horrific. It doesn't just shut down the opinions of others. That's bad enough. Censorship actually robs you of the opportunity or the right to hear that opinion. So censorship works in both ways. And instead of the Barrington proposal, Fauci and Collins and others deliberately implemented a national lockdown modeled after China's draconian response. So Maher is exhibiting his critical thinking skills here very well. The social disasters that we're now experiencing aren't the result of a pandemic as much as they are policies that were imposed from the top-down decisions made by government officials and that were then enforced through private sector vaccine mandates and deliberately propagated through social media censorship operations. So what does Bill Maher's guest, Neil deGrasse Tyson, have to say to that?
What you don't have is the benefit of the alternative scenarios to see how they would have come out, to be able to judge whether what did happen was a lesser evil than other options that would have unfolded. And so
actually we do, because other countries handled it differently. Sweden didn't handle it differently. Some of the places with the lowest vaccination rates turned out to have the best results.
with really low population densities.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, yes, there are different factors. There are.
Yes, but that matters.
Yes, of course it matters.
It's a sort of a different factor.
You just said.
I walk into an elevator in New York City, there's 15 people
okay,
right
but
here.
You just said that we can't make any judgments because we don't live in an alternative universe where America handled it differently. And I'm saying other places handled it differently. That does matter.
Dang, Bill, that was awesome. I mean, very well said. And I gotta say, this response from Tyson is frankly infuriating to me. And unfortunately, I mean, I see this all too often among academics who see reality through the prism of abstractions and theories and models and systems. And as a result, they literally are oblivious to the most obvious aspects of reality. Think about what Tyson just said there. We don't have the benefit of knowing how alternative scenarios would have turned out. You know, scenarios alternative to unconstitutional vaccine mandates. Scenarios alternative to unconstitutional government censorship operations. Scenarios alternative to multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies sponsoring virtually every major news outlet of the legacy media. I mean, it's astonishing to me. I mean, I get it. Look, I get it. He's responding to Maher's methodology, as it were, in critiquing the horrific social consequences of these policies. But Tyson is not even considering the fact that these policies weren't just deleterious to society, they were flat out unconstitutional. In other words, they were wrong. They were morally and legally repugnant. And that's where the other guy, Mike Smirkanish, chimed in with a lot more sense than this scientist.
I think it's a legitimate conversation to have. You remember there was talk of herd immunity and how we get there at the outset, and people were shouted down for even raising that prospect. I'm not the scientist you are, but in retrospect,
they shouted down the idea that it might have escaped from a lab.
Right.
That was somehow racist,
right,
as opposed to somehow if you believed that it came from the wet markets, you were a Democrat, and if you believed it came from the lab, you were a Republican. This is ridiculous.
Now, what's so interesting here is that this exchange happened actually before the Twitter files exposed the collusion between the Biden administration, along with the deep state agencies like the FBI and CDC, and Twitter, where the social media platform was more or less directed to deliberately censor particularly so-called anti-vaxxer accounts. And of course, the legacy media played right along with all of that nonsense. Back on January 29th of 2020, the Washington Post printed the headline, "Experts debunk fringe theory linking China's coronavirus to weapons research." And in the article, they made it seem as if security at the Wuhan lab was absolutely impenetrable, beyond reproach. This despite the fact that the Washington Times, just 3 days earlier, ran a piece that reported on links between the outbreak of the coronavirus and that Wuhan lab. A couple of weeks later, in February, when Senator Tom Cotton began to raise questions about what China was hiding regarding the Wuhan lab, the New York Times ran the headline, "Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory of coronavirus origins." I mean, you can't make this stuff up, gang. It's all falling apart. This whole woke hysteria is literally all falling apart. Bill Maher, to his credit, is seeing the same thing we're seeing. He's seeing a woke COVID hysteria imposed on us by government agencies and corporate boardrooms and cheerlead by legacy and social media outlets, was responsible for tremendous social harm that will take years to recover from. And all we can say to Bill is, hey, welcome to the party, pal. We're glad to have you here. As always, make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button. You'll definitely want to check out my latest video on bumbling Biden getting caught stashing classified documents in what may be a Chinese-funded location. Very interesting stuff. You're not going to want to miss it. So make sure to click on that link, and I'll see you over there. God bless.